This is Grace Notes. I'm Alan Button, and I'm actually sitting again in the home of our guest today, Jim Berardi. Again, we are socially distanced. I've got my glove on. Jim, thank you for being here again.
You're very welcome.
For those of you who tuned in last week, you know that Jim was our guest, and we focused, given that it was Memorial Day coming up, on his World War II involvement, particularly at Iwo Jima. I learned a lot about Jim in my conversation with him prior to that interview, and we thought we would continue today talking about his pre-war and post-war experiences. He's got a lot of stories to tell. Jim, maybe if you would start off by talking to us again in more detail about your growing up years, having come, as I understand it, from Campbell, Ohio, just outside of Youngstown. If I got that right?
That's right. I was born in Campbell, Ohio. Campbell, Ohio was a suburb of Youngstown, Ohio. And after a few years after the development of a steel mill on the eastern part of Youngstown, the community separated and became incorporated as Campbell, Ohio, a steel town. I was born in 1926, prior to the crash of 1929, and whenever I go back to review my early childhood, from my birth through the years, I always snicker a little bit because the girl I married was from a steel town, Farrell, Pennsylvania. Of course, their specialty was stainless steel. And before we married, I found out that she had been born in 1929. So throughout our lifetime, I'd always remind her that the stock market had crashed during that period of time, and it was the beginning of the period known as the Depression.
Jim, what was your wife's name?
My wife's name was Anne Louise Nemitz. No relation to Admiral Nemitz. I used to kid her about that. But she did have two brothers that eventually went into the service to the Navy.
Jim, I'd like to come back a little bit later to talk more about your wife and daughters, but tell you what, let's stay with the early years here. Tell us about the family grocery business.
It was a very interesting beginning. When my mother and dad had come from Italy, my dad came when he was 17 years old. He got a job where jobs were available, so when they got to New York, an uncle of his took him to the Indian Territory. At that time, it was called the Indian Territory, and he always referred to it as the Indian Territory, but it became the state of Oklahoma. My dad was here before the turn of the century, and he worked in the coal mines. First, fast forward a little bit, the children were all born in this country. My mother was born in Italy, so was my dad, and so I had three sisters, a brother, and myself, and an adopted sister. My mother adopted this girl as a child because her family had come from Italy and were visiting relatives in Akron, Ohio, and both husband and wife were killed. And my mother adopted Jenny. We had two Jennies in the family. We had little Jenny and big Jenny. Big Jenny was smaller than little Jenny, but we always called the older one Big Jenny, and then new adopted daughter Little Jenny. When my mother came, they grew up in very near the steel mill. At that time, of course, most of the housing was around the steel mill, and it became a center that all the population would locate simply because they wanted to be within walking distance to their job. So in the city of Campbell, it wasn't much larger than the city of Rocky Mount. Almost everybody was in walking distance to the mills. My mother had been here a number of years before many other immigrants came, so she knew the ropes of how to live in a more urban community, because most of these people had migrated from the Piedmont area of Italy and settled in Campbell, Ohio. Most of them would live in a tenement house and would live in a mill house similar to Rocky Mountain Mills. And as they earned enough money and saved enough money, they started to build their homes. So what developed in the community, like it developed in many cities, we had the Italian section, the Polish section, the Russian section, you name it, every nationality from Western Europe. And what happened, these people that came in weren't familiar with living in that type of situation. So my dad would go to the market to buy groceries for our family, and so the immigrants would come up and say, "Could you please buy something for us?" And so he would do that. So my mother and dad go to the market, come back, and then the neighbors would come and pick up all of the groceries that they needed. My elder sister said, "Dad, you have to charge them 15 cents or 20 cents for doing this." And so it started a little business in the bottom of a house that they just had built. And eventually, more people came, so they established Berardi's grocery store in a new building. We lived upstairs, and the grocery store was downstairs. And so everyone in the family took part in working in the grocery store until it became time for them to perhaps decide what they wanted to do in their life after graduation from high school.
Your family sounds like they were real entrepreneurs. Tell us what lessons you learned from that time in your life.
I was very young. A lot of what I learned from my brothers and sisters because they were old enough to realize that was taking place. In the early 1930s, of course, the Depression began. And it extended, and a lot of people don't realize that it had extended all the way until 1938, from 1929. Things got bad, and each year that went by got worse. The mills closed. We found that people were without work. At that time, in the 30s, they didn't have anything to fall back on. So what happened in the community, as happened in so many communities, people from different sections of Europe would settle in the same area in the city, and they developed a community within the city of Campbell. So you lived in the Italian section, Polish section, the Russian section, and without any type of security going on, coming to a foreign country without knowing how to speak English, so they attached themselves to their own organizations and clubs. So they formed many clubs. And throughout the city, from the clubs, they made mutual aid societies within the club. My dad joined the Italian Order Sons of Italy. And what they did, every month when you went to the meeting, you would pay so much money for each child that you had in your family, and you bought your life insurance. This was at the time when Metropolitan, Prudential, and other companies were just beginning. Travelers Insurance is another one. But they had more faith in the president of their club, and so therefore they would pay this dues, and in the event of death, they had something to bury the people in your family. So some of these payments would be like $100 and maybe as high as $200. So if you died, the society would give you that amount of money. Times were so difficult, I can just compare it of what's going on with the virus and the corona that's going on in our country. Jobs weren't to be found. At that time, people that saved their money in the banks had failed. We had no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to cover your investment in the bank and your savings account. That was lost. A good example would be that of my wife's family. They had only 2 years to pay on their mortgage, and there was foreclosures, so they were evicted from the place that they were living in their home. We did not have unemployment insurance. You didn't have a credit card. You couldn't go to the bank. The football stadium that we played football in Camel was built in 1936 by the PWA. Many people had to depend upon their family garden, and they would plant all of their vegetables and then can them. Many little businesses started up. My mother, who was already in the grocery business, talked to her good friend. You're selling pizza out of your cellar. There's an empty storeroom next to us. Get that storeroom. They bought a used stove, and she started a pizza business at that time. It grew enough to send her son through medical school. It's just a story of an American dream. Of course, she never dreamed when she came to this country she would be working a pizza shop.
Jim, I feel like you're giving us a lesson in history and sociology and business all wrapped up together. Tell you what, you mentioned the football stadium in Campbell. I know that was part of your background, and you've identified a song that, at least for me, connects with that football theme, the Notre Dame Victory March. Tell us about your football experience and that song.
Well, when the war was over and we came back, it was time to go to college. And so I was having in the back of my mind and picturing myself as going to Ohio State or going to Notre Dame. I was like a little Rudy at the time before Little Rudy was born as a movie. But what happened, when we were discharged and I was thinking of going to college, the contacts that I had at Ohio State, the coaching changes had taken place. And so instead of going to Ohio State, I was thinking of going to a college my brother went to, Tony Berardi. He went to Ohio Northern because that's where he got his degree in pharmacy and became a pharmacist. And so early in my life, I thought maybe I'd become a pharmacist. So when I went to this school, we found out that they informed me that if you want to go to school here, because so many GIs were going to college because we got a college education, that he said you'd have to sleep in the gymnasium for 2 years. So that changed my mind rapidly, and so I enrolled at Youngstown State University. I played football in high school, and then I played football at Youngstown State University. At that time, it was called Youngstown College. Upon graduation from college, then I got my first job in a little country school as an assistant football coach. And I substituted for half a year because a teacher had gotten ill. And the following September, they hired me full-time as a teacher. And the salary was $2,200 a year. And I got $200 a year for coaching.
I want to come back to your post-war career and coaching and so forth in just a couple of minutes. Let's take a break and hear the Notre Dame Victory March by the Notre Dame Marching Band. Here it is. That was the Notre Dame Victory March by the Notre Dame Marching Band. If you're just joining us, our guest today is Jim Berardi. Jim, you were talking about your early education career. Why don't you pick up there, if you would? Tell us about that and your wife's involvement in education and your daughters as well. They are all sort of wrapped up together, as I understand it.
I neglected to mention something that I wanted to mention about that period of depression in a city. It was amazing to me growing up in a community that had included people from so many different backgrounds. And at that time, history would teach us that America was like a melting pot of nations. And it's so true, because when the foreigners came, they brought with them all of the culture, all of their beliefs, whether it be religious, political, or any other means. They brought it with them. And there was a problem at first to get all of the immigrants that settled in the community to join together as one city, as one state, and one nation. They brought with them their music, they brought with them their literature, they brought with them their art, they brought with them a different language, and it was something that when you live through it and experience life in a community such as that, it makes you very proud that you're an American. There are so many thoughts that run through my head about living in a community that was so ethnically diverse, because you find that the people had to find a section of the town that they can understand the language. They had to find a place that they can find the foods that they liked. They started to develop an appreciation for things surrounding them that they were not familiar with. And so the community grew together, but once the schools were established at the beginning, the barriers that existed between the different nationality groups dissipated, and we became American citizens. And it's not unusual for, at that time, people to share their recipes, to share their beliefs, to share their ambitions. We find that when the children went to school, learned a language, and they had to go home, they had to teach their parents the English language. And so it was difficult at the time, but it was done. The churches would teach citizenship classes so that when you would go as a citizen to get your citizenship, you would be able to answer the questions that the judge would ask. So everyone had to pitch in, and they did.
Jim, tell us about your family and own teaching career.
Well, the immigrants that came, they all believed of the importance of education. It was sort of a known fact that when you grow up, you're going to go to school or you're going to go to college. Of course, there weren't too many choices at that time, before computers, before television, before the internet. And we're relying on radio for practically everything as far as information is concerned during that period of time. And that was exemplified by Franklin Roosevelt with the fireside chats. But the children came home and found out that their friends and their parents are having the same problems. And so little by little, all of these people began to find the American way of life. Now, in my own particular family, I had 3 daughters. It has always been in our intention from the time they were born that they would secure a college education. So through the sacrifice of my wife and myself, we both dug in and made the sacrifice to send all 3 to school.
Tell us your daughters' names.
My eldest is Marianne. She became interested in art, and she's an art historian. My second daughter, she became a graphic designer. Her name is Suzanne Gould today. All 3 are married. My third daughter, Nancy, she got the name because I like Frank Sinatra's Nancy, and she became a research scientist.
Jim, you and your wife both spent many years teaching, and I understand you went into guidance counseling as well?
Yes, originally I was in a classroom teaching American government, history, and sociology, and I found that in order to advance on the pay scale in the school system, you had to get another degree. So I did go to Westminster College. In Pennsylvania, there was a liberal arts college, and got a master's degree in education. It was there that I met Anne, and I asked her if she drank beer, and she said yes. So after class, we went and had a glass of beer, and then the story began.
The beer clinched it. Well, Jim, you You made North Carolina your home many years ago, and you've identified another one of your favorite songs, Carolina in the Morning. Can you say anything about it?
I don't know what it was, but my wife loved the South, and she always dreamed of perhaps moving south. Of course, I was a little bit reluctant at the time because you grow up in a community, you spend your first 60 or 70 years in a community, you retire, then you have to sell your house, pick up, and move. When that move took place, I had a flashback of my parents coming from Italy, but it was a lot easier for me to make a move to North Carolina. And so we decided we're going to establish our home in North Carolina.
We're going to hear Carolina in the Morning by Bing Crosby.
Nothing could be finer in Carolina, north or south. Carolina, dining, baby, with you.
That was Bing Crosby with Carolina in the Morning. Jim, we haven't touched on something that I know has become an important part of your life. Tell us about music.
Well, I've loved music, any kind of music. And when you live as long as I have, you've gone through different periods in American history, and you've gone through different periods in musical history. And as a young person, I used to like band music because every time they'd have a parade or something, and I'd love to go and listen to, watch the parade and listen to the bands. In fact, when I was in high school, I didn't know how to play an instrument, but the band director at that time knew my brother who used to play a saxophone. And he said, contact Jim, see if his brother still has that saxophone. And so I knew he had the saxophone at home, and I couldn't believe what he wanted me to do. He said the band director in the high school had a father that was a band director for an Italian band. And so at Columbus Day, the Italian band would march through all the streets trying to drum up supports to come to the Italian festival. And they needed bodies to fill the ranks in the band to make the band larger than what it was. So they fitted me with a suit and said, you're going to be in the band. And so I started by holding a saxophone on my body and marching around the streets of Camel trying to blow on a horn. Everything was going well until they had a bandstand and they would play these old John Philip Sousa marches, and I would want to make sure that I could look like I was playing. And so we played one number, and the band director came down, took the reed out of the saxophone, said, go ahead, you keep it going. He said, you played as good as you can without a reed. But anyway, that was the very, very beginning.
I used to play the saxophone, Jim, and I know you can't do much without a reed.
But in high school, I did get into percussions, and I played percussions.
Jim, I'd be interested in having you share your account of your earliest music lessons. I understand opera was something that was not particularly appealing to you.
No, I had a niece, and my sister wanted her to study vocal music, so she got her signed up, and for a couple of years she played vocal music. And then she turned to me and said, well, everybody likes the accordion, and Mom and Dad likes the accordion. Why don't you take accordion lessons? I said, I'll give it a shot. So when I was in the 7th grade or 8th grade, I went to the music school and had the same Italian piano teacher teaching accordion. And so I took lessons for just about a year, and I went to play my lesson, take the lesson, and I didn't know the assignment that he gave me. He said, what's the matter? Don't you know you practice? I said, no. He said, why not? I said, I had to go for football practice. So he called my sister Josephine, and said, Josephine, he said, your brother, he tells me he had to play football and he didn't play the accordion. I'll give you advice. Save the money. Let him play football.
Well, despite that advice, accordion, I know, has become a big part of what you do and who you are. Tell us what you do with the accordion and why you do it.
Well, anyway, I had an accordion that fell apart, and so I received one as a gift from my sister Carmel. She and my other sister were world travelers, and when she's going through Germany one time, the Horner plant that makes harmonicas produced small accordions. They're miniature accordions. And so she gave it to her son, who was in a music conservatory, as a gift. And he couldn't play it, so she passed it on to me. And so I would fool around with that through the years. Years go by and everything, and a man was selling an accordion in Tarboro, and so I bought that old accordion, and so I started to practice. And when I was in the Kiwanis Club to play, I would bring this big accordion in there and play songs there. And so I was invited one day by my daughter's neighbor, Suzanne, if I would play some songs at her church group. And I said, yes, as long as they're old people, because I play the old songs. And she said, well, give it a try. So I went over and I played for that group. The following week, I got a call from one of the ladies that was in that group, asked if I would play at a nursing home. So I went down and played at a nursing home. And from there, I traveled throughout of Rocky Mount, playing for all different occasions. And I said, I'm not an accordion player, a professional, but my accordion is out of tune, and so am I. And so I would play songs that I loved, and they were songs that the old people could recognize, and so they would have a sing-along. And so that's what I did at the beginning. So from church to church and event to event, I started to play gigs all around the city.
And if our listeners want to see you and your accordion, they can look on our Facebook page. That's what we had posted last week for our Memorial Day conversation. And tell you what, Jim, would you mind playing something for us right now?
All right, I'm going to play a little ditty together, songs that the old-timers like, and they get them tapping their feet and singing along.
Tell you what, Jim, we'll go out with whatever it is you are playing, but before we do that, let me say thank you very much for taking the time to share with us. It's been a real privilege to hear your stories, plural, to take us back to your involvement in World War II and then the many years before and after that as well. It's been a real treat. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Here Jim is on his accordion.